Cloud over the Trump White House, sometimes compared to the legal storm that took down the Nixon White House decades ago. In a moment, I'm going to talk to Martin London, an attorney who represented Nixon's Vice President Spiro Agnew, who resigned in disgrace. He is out with a new piece today telling Donald Trump to do exactly that. Resign. Agnew's resignation coming nearly 45 years ago on the same day he pled guilty to tax evasion.
The matter of Spiro Agnew, who resigned as vice president yesterday, hung over Washington today like air pollution. No one, except perhaps the president, knows who will be chosen as Agnew's successor, and Mr. Nixon isn't saying.
All right, joining me now is Martin London, who also represented a client sued by Donald Trump in 1985 and won. He is the author of the book, The Client Decides. Also with me is Harvard professor Leah Rigger. Martin, Martin, let me come to you first. I want to get your take on why should President Trump resign?
Look, he's going downhill. This is just the beginning. He's lost several of his close friends and associates, Flynn, Gates, Cohen, Papadopoulos. Now he's just lost Pecker. Seth Waxman got it right. When that doorbell rings and the guy says, "I'm from the FBI," let me tell you, it's every man for himself. So that suggests to me that the longer he waits, the worse it's going to get. I think they're going to go after the Trump Corporation now. I think Weisselberg has got immunity. You know, there's an interesting story there. The complaint says, the information says that they gave the phony invoice to Weisselberg, who gave it to executive number 2. Now, we don't know who executive number 2 is, but I'm willing to bet a nickel that the last name of that executive was Trump. So those are all state crimes, by the way.
Let me ask you this, Martin. Since you brought up this interesting point about when the doorbell rings and it's the FBI at the door, it's every man for himself. Where do you think the Trump kids, the Trump children, Donald Trump, Eric Trump, Ivanka Trump, where do they fit in all of this? What do you think is going to happen with them?
Well, look, that June meeting in Trump Tower is dynamite. Despite Rudy Giuliani, who I referred to this morning as Rudy the Clown, saying, well, they didn't know there were Russians. Of course they knew there were Russians. They had the email that said the Russian government wants to help find evidence to help your father win the election. He goes to, and he says, I love it. It's great. I think there was a crime there already. So I think then he covers up the crime. He cooks up with his father a false statement that it was about adoption. It wasn't about adoption at all. I think he's in the soup, and I think I know 1% or 10% of what's going on. So I think that the longer this goes on, the greater the exposure is going to be. The federal government is very good at this.
Leah, speaking of exposure, do you envision President Trump, can you see President Trump from his personality and psychology, a person who would resign the office of the president if he is in fact facing the FBI?
Absolutely not. I think that, Martin makes a wonderful point that particularly drawing on this history, this really important history, first things first, let me say, game recognizes game, right? So he clearly is drawing on this really important historical moment, almost 40 years to the day, where, Spiro Agnew recognized that this was the right thing to do. This was the necessary thing to do, particularly as the walls were closing in. But what we've seen from Donald Trump historically, what we're seeing from Donald Trump now is that as the walls are coming in, as the legs are coming out from under the organization, that his tendency is to double down and to fight back even when he is in the wrong, even when faced with overwhelming odds, even faced with evidence that a crime has occurred, that corruption has occurred. I think that's especially true when, if we see that his children may be involved and may be, next on the chopping block.
Yeah, Martin, did you want to add something?
Yeah, look, when we represented Spiro Agnew, we represented Spiro Agnew. The guy who was exposed there was Mr. Agnew, Vice President Agnew. We didn't have to worry about children, sons, a pair of sons, son-in-law who also had exposure. The longer this thing goes on, the greater that exposure is going to be. And if he's going to cut a deal, the farther down the line he goes, the greater is the pile of evidence the government gets, the tougher that deal is going to be. I happen to agree. Now, I don't think he would do it because I don't think he's got the, this takes a lot of contemplation. It takes a lot of balancing. It takes a lot of consideration. I don't think he's capable of that.
So to that point, sorry to cut you off, Martin, I wanted to ask really quickly because it's great to have two brilliant legal minds here. The issue of a president being indicted and whether or not he can face trial in the president seems to be resolved. Some have said that he can be indicted, but he wouldn't necessarily face the trial while he's sitting in office. What do you think? What does the legal matter tell us in terms of a sitting president being indicted or at least facing trial?
So I think that there are a couple of different ways to speak in it, and I think that Martin is far more equipped to speak to the specifics. But one thing that I'll say is that his children can face charges in a number of different ways. We also don't know what happens. I mean, again, we give the context. We'd actually have to see, and there are a couple of different ways of interpreting it. But once he steps out of office and he's no longer a sitting president,
for sure,
that also incorporates. That also means there's definitely different ways of looking at it, and that he could still be brought up on charges, particularly, to Martin's point, as this laundry list keeps coming and coming and more and more and more comes out.
Martin, what's your legal take on that?
Well, an interesting story. There had never been even any legal writing on the subject until the Agnew case. When the Justice Department was investigating the vice president, we wrote a brief and we said, you have to stop the investigation because the vice president is immune from prosecution while he's sitting in office. And we cited, the articles in Article 1 and Article 2, the impeachment articles. Elliot Richardson, the Attorney General, said, I'm going to turn this over to Mr. Bork, who was the Solicitor General, who wrote a brief. And he came back in his brief and said, well, you're right. There is a strong argument that Article 1 officers should not be indicted while in office. But I make a distinction. My client, President Nixon, he can't be indicted. The president can't be indicted, but your client, the vice president, can be indicted. And Bork's memo was the first of two DOJ memos that have concluded that a sitting president cannot be indicted.
Well, it certainly may be something that is going to be revisited in the coming months or possibly even in the coming years. Martin London, I certainly appreciate your time. Thanks very much. Leah Wright-Rigger as well. Thank you so much for your insights.
Thanks for having me.
Hey, I'm Ari Melber from MSNBC. You can see more of our videos right here, or better yet, subscribe to our YouTube channel below. You could have been anywhere in the world, but you're here with us, and we appreciate that.